Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone, depending upon where you're joining from. So I'm Joshua. I have with me here Dr. Ioannis Revalidis, and in this session, we're going to be talking about Bitcoin NFTs, and all sorts of different other related aspects. Ioannis, maybe do you want to talk a bit about some upcoming events that we have?
Yes, thanks, Joshua. First of all, hi, everybody. Again, depending on the time zone, of course, as Joshua mentioned, might be good morning, good evening, or whatever. Joshua, I think it's an excellent opportunity starting up this series of meetings here on Zoom on all kinds of current issues on blockchain related matters. But this is not the only activity that we undertake at the Center for Distributed Ledger Technologies, right? I mean, we have two rather steady programs. One is an MSc in blockchain, an MSc which offers 3 specializations, one in computer science, one in business and finance, and one in law. This is, so to speak, the full-blown experience where we talk in much more detail about everything. Everything being the technology, the economics, and the law, of course, of blockchain-related activities. But next to that, we also have our summer school. We had our first version last year, and we have prepared everything for the second version this year as well. In fact, we will be announcing it within the very next few days. And since today we're talking about NFTs, it's probably worth mentioning that during the summer school, and more specifically on July 26, we're going to be organizing a big NFT law conference where we're going to have 15 to 16 presentations on all matters on current legal research on NFTs. So probably worth looking at during the next few weeks.
Definitely. Excellent. So what we're going to do, because we have a diverse audience with newcomers, newbies, people have no idea about blockchain, all the way to people who have, Ioannis is
like me, I can relate to that.
To experts and some of our master's graduates. And we're going to start briefly by introducing some of the concepts and then get a bit more deeper into some various related aspects about Bitcoin, NFTs, and the like. So we'll also distribute these slides so everyone can have access to whatever they need to. We have our center's link here where you can find other information to do with what we do, our contact details, and so on. But let's start with money, something that is very important in our everyday lives, right? We all know how to use digital money. We all have our digital apps that allow for us to send each other funds. And we often perceive that when I am sending my funds, let's say to Ioannis, I go into the app, send him funds, and I think that that's a direct transaction. But really and truly what's happening is that app is sending a message to my bank, and my bank is saying, yes, they will let me spend my money and send it to Ioannis. So they are authorizing that transaction. And you may also have at the receiving end, the other bank who is accepting that transaction. So really and truly, this is not like a cash transaction where I can just give Ioannis my money and he can take it. There are intermediaries who have to approve of this. So the banking system has full control of how you can spend your money when you're using the banks. Now, when we talk about Bitcoin, there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of FUD out there. Ignore all of the speculation, all of the hype. We're not concerned with that here. Ignore a lot of the also negative criticism about illicit activity, energy consumption. We'll talk about those sort of issues in some other talks, but they're really not as much as concerns as the publicity make them out to be. What I want to focus on here is the ability to have a person-to-person transaction. A digital transaction where I can send Ioannis my money, my Bitcoin, without any bank or any other intermediary having the ability to reject that transaction or needing to accept that transaction. So before this, we couldn't do anything of the sort. The only way we could achieve this is if I physically gave Ioannis my money, my cash. So Bitcoin is kind of like digital cash. Although there is some controversy over whether it is cash or more like gold. Again, we'll talk about that in some future episode. But we have this ability now that I can just click. I want to send Jonas 1 Bitcoin, which is some 20,000 euros right now. And
that would be great also.
It will.
20,000 is always welcome, right?
And he'll receive it, which is great. If we think about the traditional banking system and traditional systems in general, there's a computer or a collection of computers that the bank owns, they have full control over, and they have their software keeping track of who owns what. Great. Now, what blockchain does to facilitate what we talked about in Bitcoin, blockchain is the mechanism that allows for us to achieve this person-to-person transaction. So Bitcoin is this first current cryptocurrency that was proposed, and blockchain is the mechanism that allows for us to remove the central bank from the system. And how does it achieve this? What it does is it replicates on every single computer the whole logic, the whole banking system as such, every single transaction. And you can run your own Bitcoin nodes, and you can be part of this network, so you can see everything that's happened. And if you try to cheat on your system, the rest of the network is just going to ignore what your system is doing. So this is really what blockchain achieves, if we think about it, is a single computer, an abstract. This computer doesn't exist. It's an abstract computer that doesn't exist anywhere. It's made up of many of our computers working together that allows for us to keep a history of all transactions that ever took place. But different to the banking system, no one can manipulate this. Even if I developed the code, which I wish I did, there's this character, Satoshi Nakamoto, who created this system. Even Satoshi Nakamoto, the creator of this system, at least the original source and the idea, if he wanted to change a transaction or the code, he cannot do that. So now you might say, how do we come up with new versions? Then we can discuss about governance structures, but ignore that for now. The main thing here is not even the developer can manipulate the data or transactions. So the system will do exactly what it's written to do. And we have Bitcoin, which is the first thing that proposed this. It's the first thing that proposed this type of system. It proposed this blockchain mechanism under the hood, along with a few other things put together, creates these types of systems. The next then evolution in these types of systems was where we realized we can do more than just an accounting system on a computer. Just like on your desktop, your Windows, your Mac, or your Linux, whatever you use, you can run different software. On blockchains, we can run different applications. And this is where new types of blockchains like Ethereum came out, proposing where you can upload your own programs. And these programs are what we call smart contracts. But ignore that term now for a while. Just accept the fact that now we can run different types of software in a manner where no one has control over that software. The software will do exactly what it's written to do. So then one particular type of, I would say, usage of these types of applications was to come up with a way of not only keeping track of currency, who owns what amount of value, what amount of euro or crypto or Bitcoin or Ether, or whatever, we thought that we also need to keep track of unique items. So we might want to keep track of who owns a particular car in the real world, right? We do this nowadays. We have our car registries who keep track of who owns what. It's in a digital system. And the thing is, they have full control of it. And that's probably a good idea that they keep track of who owns what cars. But if we wanted to, we could also keep track of who owns cars on a blockchain, where we're saying we don't trust you, the car authority, to keep track of it. But it's not just about physical objects, it's also digital objects. So let's think about games. CryptoKitties was a very early game that was proposed. It's kind of similar to Tamagotchi, these little devices that kids used to feed their animals and make sure that they keep them alive. And you could do various things. You can also buy and sell cats. You can create collections. You can even get two of your cats, breed them together, and you have a new cat, or you unlock rare traits. Now, the thing is, when you unlock a new cat, are you guaranteed to own that new cat? Like you might say, this sort of game that I'm talking about, we've been using games like this for 2 decades. What is new here? How is it so different? So if we were to look at how we could do this before blockchain existed, you would log on to myfavoritepet.com, whatever site where your cat is, and feed him. And the thing is, you own him, right? The site says that you own him, you can feed him. However, they could take that cat away from you. They could kill him. They could make sure you don't have enough food. They have full control over that cat, over that item. The NFT way is that we use a blockchain under the hood, which means that no one has control over that cat or this item. No one can take it away from you because the code says you are the owner and only you can transfer that cat. Not even the company, if they created this website, which uses a blockchain under the hood, not even could they take that cat away from you. So instead of the company having control on what you can do, now you have full control, and the company behind, even the company behind the system, has no control on these tokens. Now, these NFTs, we call them non-fungible tokens, because fungibility means the ability to have €1 and another euro. They're interchangeable, they're fungible. So fungible currencies are things where you don't care if you have one instance of it or another. One €5 note is exactly the same as another €5 note, though there might be differences that I think Jonas is going to mention at some point. Yes. And non-fungible tokens means that there's a unique item. It's not exchangeable. Even if there's another Pitty, it's not exchangeable. They're unique. They have different properties.
So if I might,
of course,
because you used a term quite often, you said you own it, you have ownership and the such. Although at some point you did it quote unquote, and I agree with that. I think we need to make a very important distinction, because the word ownership, both in legal terms but also in everyday discussions, carries a very intense meaning, and it might create misconceptions. The whole idea when we're talking about non-fungible tokens is that what they can achieve is that this is a decentralized way of keeping track of who is entitled to exercise some kind of control over a digital asset. Now, to explain that in plain language, if you have an NFT certificate, it means that the blockchain ecosystem shall accept that you are the person entitled to be associated with a specific digital asset, right? That's what it is. Because in the very early days of non-fungible tokens, legal people, surprise, surprise, were not consulted, and probably makes sense in the very early stages. The word ownership took everybody by storm, right? Wow, ownership. Does that mean that I have the exclusivity rights that come with ownership? The reality is much more complicated when it comes to non-fungible tokens. So it is important to be stressed that when we're talking about ownership, we're talking about ownership in a non-legal sense. We're talking about ownership in the sense that within an ecosystem, you have a digital certificate that entitles you some kind of control over an asset. And everybody needs to respect that. That's the whole idea. Whether this amounts to the legal notion of property or not, that is a very hotly debated issue. We have seen all kinds of different developments. There are court decisions in Singapore and the UK that seem to imply that some kind of legal proprietary interest might be involved there. But I cannot stress enough that these are decisions that were decided on the basis of certain particularities of the common law legal system, which means that they cannot be easily transposed to other continents or other legal areas. For example, in Europe, I would say that it is a huge question mark on how we are supposed to be treating these assets. I think assets is the best word to describe, and it is mutually enough. I'm not implying that it is impossible. I do have a provisional personal opinion on whether property is the right legal institution or not, but probably we can discuss that at some point later. But I think it was important to stress that when we talk ownership, we talk about ownership in computer science terms, not in legal terms, right?
Indeed. So to amplify on that argument, If I were to own this kitty on this blockchain and no one can take it away from me because the code will do exactly what it's written to do, if Ioannis takes me to court because for some reason or other he thinks that it should be his, or rather, if Ioannis believes he should be able to take me to court, let's say he doesn't know who I am, number one, I'm anonymous. Well, he can't take me to court. Let's say that he does know who I am and he does take me to court, and the court says I have to give him my CryptoKitty. I could say, well, try to take it from me. And
come and take it, right?
They won't manage, it's there, it's mine. So it's mine again from a computer science. Good luck in taking it away from me, unless I actually transfer it.
Yes.
So we do now have this debate, kind of a debate between I own it and he can't take away, but ultimately, and I'm a computer scientist and I'm now starting to agree with you on this, ultimately we live in a land and it's the laws of the land that override whatever takes place in the physical world. The laws of the land will somehow seek recourse. Now, the interesting thing is, Jonas, we could at some stage change these laws if it made more sense to recognize different types of ownership perhaps as well.
Definitely. And there is a lot of discussion both at national and European and international level. There is indeed a big discussion, which is mostly fueled by developments in the blockchain space. People don't want to admit it, but in reality, the digital assets that we are supposedly abstractly discussing in legal circles are all more or less blockchain based, because blockchain is the primary field where we keep track of assets, digital assets, right? And on the example that you mentioned, also, I agree that we need to be careful that up to a certain extent, there might be a misalignment between what blockchain and its code says and what state laws might say. But I would say that unlike certain opinions that have been expressed here and there, that is not necessarily bad. And that does not necessarily mean that the two cannot align. If we think about it, people we need to accept that blockchains are not some kind of mechanism of an objective truth. The fact that certain assets are being tracked on a blockchain does not necessarily mean that the people that are associated with certain assets within a blockchain are entitled to do so. If we were to accept this, which is probably an extreme take, this would amount to the following. Let's say that you obtain an NFT, right? And I hack you. If we are to abide by blockchain truth, then by blockchain truth, although I hack you, which is something that usually people frown upon, right? The blockchain says that I am the one now who is in control of it, so that's it. Take it or leave it, right? Your other option would be to just stop using blockchains. But I think that would be counterproductive for everybody. What I'm trying to say is that I do understand that, of course, the ethos of digital communities is not always 100% the same like the ethos of good old legal rules. But we must not forget that our good old legal rules, they kind of represent an average of common sense. And I think that digital communities can benefit from that average common sense. Of course, this is a two-way process. There are also values that emerge on digital communities that might be interesting for wider societal contexts as well. One of them being able to have independent control over digital assets. In this slide that we display right now, actually what we display is the huge divide between Web 2.0 and what Web 3.0 could be. In Web 2.0, when we look at the left, right, it is the situation where a powerful platform controls everything. Our entire digital experience is dependent upon the whims of a platform. And because we have quite some experience with Web 2.0, we all know that this kind of control on the side of platform has been extremely misused by all accounts. The fact that blockchain communities insist on creating digital environments where average users can either transact peer-to-peer, as you said in the beginning, or that they are entitled to have a greater level of control over certain assets is not necessarily a bad idea. And our laws need to take that into account. I say that because the EU, the usual proponent of regulating anything digital, is heavily involved also in the blockchain space. The MiCA is about to come soon, right? And I notice a tendency of the legislator, but also in part legal academia, to treat blockchains as another version of Web 2.0, which is clearly not. I don't think it's prudent to legislate blockchains using the ethos, philosophy, and values of Web 2.0. Because simply put, as you said, such digital communities have the ability to revolt if we don't respect their ethos up to a certain extent. And that would be counterproductive as well.
That's right. So this is an interesting topic on what Jonas mentioned before on code is law. So what it exactly defines law, and I think we'll host another session on our thoughts on code is law, and we'll probably get a bit heated on that between me and Jonas. But okay, we now have this ability to own our digital asset. It could be a CryptoKitty, it could be a digital piece, a digital art piece. It could be even my physical world car or my house, which is linked to the blockchain. Obviously, the laws of the land need to honor the fact that this blockchain token is really representative of my house in the real world. So these things exist. They've existed since at least 2017, probably 15, 14. I don't know exactly when NFTs were proposed, but they've been existing and we've been using them. Bitcoin NFTs have emerged over the past few weeks as this new thing. So what, right? Well, the thing is, let's start with one aspect that has allowed for NFTs to become more acceptable on Bitcoin. Because the thing is, Bitcoin didn't really allow for NFTs before. Kind of did, but not to this extent. So what is a Bitcoin? A Bitcoin really is not a unit, it's a unit of currency, just like a dollar is a unit of currency, but it can be broken up into smaller denominations. So a Bitcoin is actually made up of 100 million Satoshis. So you can think of that kind of like how $1 equals 100 cents. The smallest denomination is 1 Satoshi. And maybe in future, 1 Satoshi will roughly be equal to a cent. That would be great. So this single 1 Bitcoin can be broken up into 100 million single 1 cents, single 1 Satoshis. And because of ordinals, this is a new, it's a new theory, ordinal theory that has been proposed. We can uniquely identify Satoshis from whatever number to whatever number, and they can have a serial number. And similar things have been proposed in the past called color coins, but this ordinal theory way of doing it has taken over. Now, Jonas, you had mentioned something about a euro note before.
Yes, indeed. The way I understand it, Joshua, because I don't understand the exact technology, or to the extent that it involves math, they lost me. But the way I understand it, if I were to put it in simple terms, right? As we currently stand, Bitcoins and Satoshis, we call them fungible for the reasons that you mentioned earlier, that we don't really care about the individual unit that we hold. We care about the value that they represent. 1 Satoshi is 1 Satoshi, 1 Bitcoin is 1 Bitcoin. I don't really care which one of them I have. In essence, the same applies to traditional money, right? I mean, if something costs 20 euros, I don't really care which bill I'm going to use to pay for it. It's any 20 euro bill. This is the nature of these assets. But even in traditional money, sometimes human boredom or ingenuity, you can put it both terms, they might change that narrative a bit. I remember, for example, my father told me an interesting story. Once he was hospitalized for 6 months. That is, of course, a couple of decades ago. Greece did not introduce euro yet. We used our good old currency drachmas. And his father, my grandfather, gave him a 500 drachma bill in order to pay for his everyday expenses while at the hospital. At the time, that was a lot of money in Greece. And out of boredom, my father started drawing things on the 500 drachma bill. He told me that he wrote his name and his place of origin, so to speak. And for some reason now, this asset, which for all intents and purposes is fungible, and it's performing fungible activities, it obtained a certain sentimental value for him. He stopped looking at it so much as a means to obtain goods and services, but he developed some kind of a bond with it. In fact, he had to pay eventually for something, so he had to give it up. But 20 years after his hospitalization and while he was operating our family business, somebody paid and used the same 500 bill that he inscribed back in the day. And he never used it as money anymore, right? He put it on a frame and he used it as a memorabilia, which means that it is not impossible for human beings to give a different social and economic meaning to assets that are otherwise fungible, right? Okay, traditional money, of course, does not give us too much of a leeway to create fine art. But look, even writing one's name, right? Okay, I understand my data protection colleagues, of course, will be worried about all the data protection repercussions, but for our sakes, that is the least of our worries. But even one's name personalizes it more. It makes it non-fungible in the sense that people attach an independent meaning, social or economic, to the asset that comes with these particular characteristics. And the way I understand this new trend in the Bitcoin space is that Satoshis, of course, are fungible as they always were, but the fact that they allow, technically speaking, to somehow add metadata on them that can be conceptualized differently, I think that's the core idea behind it. My father wrote his name on a 500 drachma bill, which gave it a different meaning. On a Satoshi, we can write, I don't know, we can include a line of code, or we can include a message. Hello, this is my Satoshi, which might change now the focus.
That's right. So this euro note, this, let's say a €5 note or whatever, if Banksy so happens to create an art piece on a €5 note, most likely that would be attributed a lot more value just because of this addition of Banksy's art image on this euro note. And that's what now is trying to be achieved. Because using ordinal theory, we can track each individual Satoshi, the smallest denomination of Bitcoin. We can track it over the history. We also can inscribe data on these Satoshis. So this is where the inscriptions terminology is coming about. And the only thing that we're saying is we can add data onto a coin. We can add data onto a transaction. Now, Bitcoin, really, the only thing that it was meant to do is to allow for transfer of Bitcoin or any Satoshis. And it keeps a history of all transactions since the beginning of time in a decentralized manner where no one has any control over the system. But given how it's been designed and some recent changes, we can also store data in transactions. Now, some people say this is nothing new, and as such, it is nothing new. We've had colored coins, which are similar to ordinal theory. We've also, since the very first Bitcoin transaction in the Genesis block, Satoshi, when he created the system, the very first transaction includes this statement inscribed into it. So the Times 3rd January 2009 chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks. And this is where Satoshi was giving a message to the world that the banking system failed. And this is another part to Bitcoin. It's not just about decentralization and ownership of money. It's also about controlling the monetary system. Right now, our central banks decide how much money to pump in, how much money to take out. And that was one of the main reasons for the crash in 2008, 2009. In Bitcoin, there's no power that can do this. There's a set number of Bitcoins that are released over time, and no one can change that. So that's another reason why Bitcoin was proposed. Ioannis, you're going to say something, I think.
I agree in essence. My feeling is just that on Bitcoin, the central decisions about the supply and the time intervals during which supply will be released have been decided on the beginning. And since it runs on so-called immutable code on the blockchain, there is a guarantee that there is not going to be any manipulation. Of course, the fact that Bitcoin releases a certain supply of Bitcoins over time also influences the price of the asset, right? Which is similar to what happens with money. But surprise, surprise, Bitcoin for once doesn't have the volatility that government money has because it is more prone to political decisions, right? Political decisions about money can change quite often depending on what government is in power and of course what circumstances it is facing, whereby Bitcoin is less flexible when it comes to that. It has been programmed once back in the day. It will always be like that. Nobody can really change it. We can, of course, here and there make updates to the protocol and the such, but other than that, the basic structure will remain the same. And I say so, right, because it's funny, Bitcoin is usually accused of having huge volatility on its price, which is true, right? But it is less volatile when it comes to its supply and the time when supply is released, right?
Indeed. So Bitcoin has actually been modeled similar to gold, where it takes work to find Bitcoin, and the Bitcoin that is found over time is becoming less and less and less, more scarce like gold. And the way that it works is there's every 4 years, there's what we call a halving period, where the amount of Bitcoin that we will find becomes half there onwards. And this means that the same amount of work is going in to find that Bitcoin, but you're finding half of it. So suddenly it's worth more to us. And this is where the economic model behind Bitcoin is meant to closely resemble gold. And in fact, I can't remember if it's the SEC or CFTC head said that Bitcoin is a commodity and most likely the only commodity, which means it's like gold. So
which is good because usually the SEC tries to classify everything as a security, right? It's good that for once they did something different. But Joseph, I'm happy that you say so. In fact, just yesterday, we're having a master session with our master's law students. And I was trying to explain them just that although Bitcoin was originally designed to perform the role of money, over time, it has probably failed to perform that role because of the so-called price volatility, because it started behaving more as a commodity, which even in legal terms makes a huge difference if we classify it as a commodity for all intents and purposes. That is a very interesting discussion. I think that it would serve another meeting probably.
Indeed. So eventually we can at least imagine a time where we shift from pricing in euros, in dollars, and fiat, and we start pricing in Bitcoin. I mean, we can imagine it. I'm not sure when it would come about, if it would come about, but if we did that overnight, suddenly there's no volatility. Suddenly we're using Bitcoin, and it's the other currencies that are volatile to our value. But we've had this idea of inscripting data into the Bitcoin network since the very beginning. And there have been various different types of encodings of data, it was very limited in the amount of data that we could encode. And the thing is, now with this ordinal theory and now with these inscriptions that have been enabled through some Bitcoin network updates, we can encode more data. So we can actually encode an image into, instead of having just a message, we can have an image inscribed into the transaction. And whether this was a design feature on purpose or it just so happened to allow for this to happen, these changes that they've done in the network, because there is some controversy in the community about whether this should be done or shouldn't be done. The thing is, it can be done and people are doing it. And this is why we need to discuss it. So now that we can encode images into Bitcoin's network, which is a bit different to Ethereum, right, Ioannis? How do you see Ethereum a bit different? And I'm putting Ioannis on the spot for the technical details as well. It's good to keep each other on each other's feet.
Yeah, the irony, the day that I would come to explain technical stuff, right? But the way I understand it as a person who is not a computer scientist, right? The way I understand it on Ethereum is that, the basic iteration of non-fungible tokens on Ethereum, right, is that there is a digital certificate which appears as a normal blockchain transaction on the Ethereum ledger. This is the, so to speak, certificate part. And the typical iteration is that this certificate points to a digital file that rests outside of the Ethereum blockchain in a so-called, usually, IPFS server, which is a form of a decentralized storage. Decentralized not in the blockchain sense, because sometimes that creates some misconception, but it is, let's say, a type of decentralized server without nonetheless operating on a blockchain. which is the typical model, right, that we have on Ethereum, which, by the way, creates all kinds of complications, I have to add. And it adds complications both at the technical level and at the legal level. First and foremost, it undermines the level of control that somebody can exercise over the asset that is stored outside of the blockchain. There is no guarantee that this asset will always be there, because, of course, this server can always be compromised. There is, of course, also another asset that, at least from some experimentation that I did over the past few months, these files on these IPFS servers are open to anybody. And it kind of defeats the purpose, right? On the one hand, you have a certificate on the blockchain that says that you're supposed to be associated with that, but then everybody can go to the IPFS link. And in essence,
this would be the same though as well. So
right,
it's available on the Bitcoin network. So there's a similarity there as well.
Okay, good. Now, of course, on Ethereum, there are other iterations as well. There are NFT projects. CryptoPunks was the first, but others followed suit. Gnars is one of them, that they are storing both the certificate and the underlying assets on chain. The underlying asset, I mean, right, it is the digital file to where the certificate points, so to speak, which probably allows a better degree of control already at technical terms, because in this case, everything happens on the blockchain, which means that the moment you transfer the certificate, you also transfer the assets. So you don't have this division between the two. There is, of course, as far as I can follow, a third model out there, which is a little bit different, but it's not so Ethereum dependent. So I will let it be for the moment.
So coming back to CryptoPunks, and what does it actually mean? So there's this CryptoPunk. It's a trivial image. I'll bring up a picture of a pixel punk, as Jonas is explaining. But I can buy this CryptoPunk and own it. It's in my wallet. It's mine. But what does that actually mean? What can I really do with that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Joshua. We need to make something clear. Most people say we're going to buy a CryptoPunk, right? But this is mostly, again, not legally accurate. In legal terms, a sales contract means that we transfer ownership, legal ownership over an asset, and ownership in legal terms comes with exclusivity, right? Now, in the case of traditional NFTs, I would say that this is not really the case. We borrow the language. We say we sell and buy NFTs, but in reality, all we do is contracts of assignment, more or less, from legal terms. And let me explain that in very simple terms, what that means. Every NFT, no matter whether it is stored on-chain or off-chain, in reality is a contractual architecture. It is a series of contracts between different parties, right? And in this contractual architecture, there is first and foremost an important convention that if the blockchain displays you as having an NFT certificate, then the entire community needs to accept that, right? That is the power of the blockchain. If you see me on the blockchain being associated with a certificate, it means that you have to respect that. This is the service, so to speak, that especially the Ethereum blockchain offers to people that have entered the market of NFTs. In essence, they use the power of their blockchain to associate people with certificates in this manner. That is a contract in reality. That is a contract between the Ethereum blockchain and the people that mint the NFTs.
What is it again? So
it is a contract. It is a contract between the Ethereum blockchain and the person that mints the NFT.
So the fact that the person who creates the NFT has a guarantee with the Ethereum blockchain that NFT will remain there as is forever.
That is what the Ethereum blockchain promises you. It promises you that if you mint an NFT, that means that you're going to create a certificate in my blockchain, which will associate you with a digital asset in an immutable manner. It means that if all things go well and nobody hacks you, that nobody will be able to take it from you. And by the way, I will do that publicly, which means that I'm also selling you the credibility that my public blockchain network offers. I'm offering you the power that an entire community of people will have to accept this convention, right?
Indeed. So I guess the community, the wider community, they don't have to accept it. They can see it there, but they don't have to say, we honor your ownership, right? I can create a copy of it.
Well, that comes now the second part, right? We talked about the
Okay.
relationship between the person that mints the NFT and the NFT blockchain, right?
Okay.
What
So
other participants do now within the community, of course, it is a different question, right?
So then my question is, before we move on to that, this contract exists with Ethereum, but Ethereum doesn't exist. Okay, there's a thing called Ethereum Foundation, but it's not Ethereum. The network is a bunch of different people working together, and the code will do exactly what it's written to do, right?
Yes, that is a great hurdle here. I agree. Although in the case of Ethereum, I have an easy pass on that because my belief is that Ethereum is not really decentralized. Ethereum has clearly a foundation that calls all the shots, which means that we can find a contractual counterparty here. No matter how radical my idea might hear, in reality, that's what it is. Because look, if Vitalik Buterin decides that your NFTs are not going to be hosted on Ethereum anymore, the next day they are not. We have seen that time and time again on Ethereum, that whatever its founder says it's going to happen. I mean, the best example I can use here is the update on the consensus mechanism. Nobody was asked at some point. Vitalik Buterin said, yeah, Ethereum endgame, we're changing from proof of work to proof of stake. Ta-da, there you have it, right? I think there is a certain strong power there. But I would agree with you that in the more decentralized structure that it is Bitcoin, we might have to come up with a different arrangement. I would not question the fact that a contract exists, but it might take us a little bit more effort to identify some kind of a contractual counterparty, right? Impossible? Not necessarily impossible. More complicated? Yes. But even on Bitcoin, you know, looking up before we met up today for the webinar, I noticed, I look a little bit at the history of Bitcoin updates, right? And even in Bitcoin, you see that there is some kind of a community that seems to be calling the shots. Of course, it is not as easily identifiable as it is on Ethereum, and it does not manifest itself as often and as decisively. But it seems that some kind of power is behind there. But I mean, it is an idea worth investigating further, nonetheless, right? I'm not saying that this is an absolute solution.
And there are different layers of power, right? So there's people who make proposals, there's people who implement proposals. Ultimately, there's the infrastructure, the people running the computers who decide we're going to run that or not. So there's different layers, but clearly there is a collection of entities, individuals undertaking this. Now, how decentralized is that? And does it make sense to ever find a party behind that? Or does it become infeasible? I think these are the questions that we'll have to answer at some point. For example, with these data inscriptions,
yes,
if anything really illegal is ever on Bitcoin. So 2013-ish, there were claims that there's porn and illegal porn on the network. It happens to be links, URLs, so very short amount of data, which is just a website linking to where the porn is. And one could argue that they're not actually distributing porn because it's just a URL. Even Google may be distributing these at points. However, now with inscriptions, ordinals, and the ability to store more data, this could eventually come about. And whether it comes about on Bitcoin or another network, we could eventually have networks distributing illegal information. What do we do then? Do we just live with it and we may just have to live with it? Or do we have to find some solution to mitigate that?
Which is a very important question, because it reminds us that nothing should be taken to the extreme, right? Decentralization as a principle might be serving certain purposes. And for these purposes, it might be the right recipe or tool. For example, having more independence over digital assets, decentralization is probably a good way to go, right? But then when we come to such content like the one you mentioned, decentralization, instead of a solution, it becomes a problem. And of course, we all have this experience from the traditional internet, that people will engage in such activities if given the tools, right? On Bitcoin right now, it is far more rare for many reasons, both because the community is more niche, because the tools are not so available to common people like me that don't really have the tech skills to do these things and the such. But eventually it might become a problem because, as you said, what we witness now with inscriptions is that with every Bitcoin update, we might have a repurposing of the network that was not predicted by the people doing the update, right? And that creates now two questions. First, should eventually Bitcoin obtain a community where such things are going to be discussed openly and measures are going to be taken, because randomness here might create dead ends, right? And of course, the second issue that is created is if that happens, nonetheless, what can we do? You mentioned Google as an example earlier that, of course, in traditional internet, we can use Google to regulate because, in essence, everything goes through them. And therefore, if we flex our legal powers over Google indirectly, we're causing problems to the perpetrators. In decentralized architectures, that might be more of a bet. In which case, the fact, for example, that Ethereum has such a governing body makes it more susceptible to be able to address such situations, right? I know that Ethereum is in very loyalist crypto circles not the best blockchain anymore because it has introduced a lot of centralization, and I can understand that up to a certain extent. But if we remind ourselves of the DAO hack, which is another instance, it was not as extreme as child pornography, but it was a hack, right? It was, I think, 150 million at stake. The fact that somebody could interfere and could coordinate a mitigation action, it caused a lot of friction within the community. Yes, this is why we have Ethereum and Ethereum Classic. Yes, but it displays that there comes a point where difficult decisions are going to be made for the network to carry on existing. And as I was saying earlier, it's all about how much of certain values can be tolerated, right? There might be, for example, a digital community where people between themselves believe that child pornography is okay. But the question is, can they impose this belief on everybody else? This is the basic question. And if the answer is no, which apparently is no, then we will start thinking about mitigation strategies. Is it easy? I don't think so. But let's say that at this stage of their development, I think that Bitcoin is less susceptible in the sense that because it was always trying to be some kind of money or commodity, it does not open so many windows, whereby Ethereum, on the other hand, has opened up the door for all these kinds of issues. And in a way, you kind of feel that it is kind of natural that it has this kind of governing body, because these are difficult decisions to be made.
Indeed. And we can see that these sort of issues are arising just by talking about a traditional CryptoPunk. And we have talked about the minter's contract with the blockchain platform, this contract that it's not written. It's not what I will call a legal contract that Jonas will hate.
But it is both. It is both code and a contract, you know.
Because a contract is always a legal contract. But it exists there because there's meeting of the mind. People have made an agreement, and how we're going to go about that is not clear. But then there's other arrangements on top, right? Once the NFT is minted there.
Exactly. There are other arrangements. I agree. I mean, once you mint the NFT, then you open up an opportunity for further contracts to happen. Usually, I mean, let's say that you, Joshua, you mint an NFT, right? And then you put it on a marketplace. When you put it on an NFT marketplace, you have signed another contract. Now it is a contract between you and the marketplace. What is the service that the marketplace is offering you? It offers you the service of marketing your NFT, because otherwise nobody would ever know that you have minted that NFT, right? If you try to do it completely at peer-to-peer level, it's a little bit more complicated, right? But if you put it on a marketing platform, you have another now relationship, which is between the person minting the NFT and the platform. And that is another contract there. And by the way, because people interested to buy NFTs will visit the platform where your NFT is displayed. That is another independent contract now between the person interested to acquire the NFT and the platform, which, intermediates in a way between you and your potential customers, so to speak.
I was looking at certain NFTs on a particular platform, and I bought one once. I mean, I've bought, right? But I've bought this particular one, let's say, and what rights, what obligations are there? I never saw anything of the sort. Are there?
Yes. That is a very good question, because it brings us to the point where we will have to wonder, okay, we put down an computer architecture that allows these transactions to happen, right? Allow people to mint NFTs, right? And allow people to send them peer-to-peer to somebody else, right? But how does that now stand from a legal point of view? Well, as I said, it is a network of contracts, right? We said the contract between the person minting the NFT and the blockchain ecosystem. It's the contract between the person minting the NFT and the marketing platform. It is a contract between the marketing platform and the person interested to obtain the NFT. And finally, when the peer-to-peer NFT transaction happens, is a contract between the person minting the NFT and the person acquiring the NFT. These are all independent contractual transactions. They have nothing to do with one another from a legal point of view. They are completely independent. But the functioning of the NFT ecosystems requires them to all function properly. At any given step, you mint the NFT. You put the NFT on a marketing platform. I visit the marketing platform. We do a transaction between us, you and I. All of them need to function properly for the NFT ecosystem to be viable. Because if we have a hiccup on any of these steps, then it's all going to go down the drain.
Yeah.
And that now creates two possible risks. One is the technological risk, that the code might fail. And if I learned anything from you the past 1.5 years, is that code will always fail, no matter how much good effort we're going to put, right? And the other is that we might have a failure at the human relationships between the participants. For example, you sent me your cryptocurrency, and I don't send you the NFT, right? It can happen, right?
If you're a platform.
Sorry?
If you're like using smart contracts, we can automate that. But let's say you were a centralized
entity. But everybody does that now through centralized entities, right? At any given point, we might have such risks. And I think that you and I have engaged in a big discussion between ourselves on what is the good mix of technical and legal assurances in order to keep the system going. By the way, just to avoid any misunderstandings, we are not criticizing NFTs, right? No. In fact, we are neutral. We don't know whether they are good, bad, or anything. We're just trying to say that if they are supposed to function nonetheless, that there needs to be a set of technical and legal assurances, to use a computer science term, in order to allow them to function. And I'm not entitled to talk about the technical assurances, but for the legal assurances, I can tell you that in the majority of cases, we have contracts for the provision of services. And that is important because if you know the type of the contract, immediately you know the kind of legal remedies that you can exercise in case that something goes wrong. I see a network of contracts for the provision of services. For example, I think that minting an NFT is a contract for the provision of services. Putting an NFT on a marketplace is a contract for the provision of services. But the peer-to-peer NFT transaction, when finally your NFT, the one that you minted, you sent it to my wallet, I think that this is a contract for assignment, as we call it in legal terms. Definitely, I would say not a contract for sale. This is why sometimes we say we buy NFTs or the such, but legally speaking, that is not accurate. What you are actually doing is, if I were to put it in simple terms, when you mint an NFT, you receive the service from the blockchain network that you are uniquely associated with an asset. So when you sell me the NFT, in essence, you assign me your claim vis-a-vis the blockchain network. You used to have that claim against the blockchain network. Now I replace you in that claim. I come in your stead. That's when it comes to the certificate, right? Yeah. The underlying asset, the monkey or the punk or the inscription, it's a different story because copyright concerns come in. And let me put it bluntly, in the vast majority of cases, we don't have a transfer of copyright. We have a license. People need to understand that when they say that they buy NFTs, in reality, all they do is be granted a license. And in fact, I don't have to say much. For those of us that are following us, let me send a link. I have a link from the 12-fold auction of Yuga Labs, right? Which was the one that I believe created all the craze about inscriptions and the such, among, of course, others. And I will send a link to the license that they are using. This time, Yuga Labs is, I have to admit, Yuga Labs is far more honest. When they started selling their monkeys on Ethereum, they were talking about ownership and the such, but I see that with 12-fold, they do not use that language anymore. They clearly say that they offer a license. And for those of our viewers that are interested, I will send on the chat the link to the license. They can go through it. They will immediately see that in essence, all they get is a license. By the way, copyright becomes here a problem because these inscriptions come with some kind of art, right? And for our viewers that don't have a legal background, copyright is the field of law, of course, that protects such assets. And they all need to take into account that according to EU law, at least, the standard to obtain copyright protection is fairly low. An inscription might be a black or white, I don't know, ugly picture. It doesn't have to be Leonardo da Vinci level. It will still be protected under copyright law. I don't know about AI generated. That's a different story. That's for a different webinar, right?
So, I mean, there's copyright law, which is protecting who owns the actual IP behind that piece. But what does it then mean? So I have a license to use a particular image in most of the time. Yes. Well, let's say that someone promised me that I own it. What does that mean?
Well, you know, legally speaking, it can mean many things, right? First and foremost, I mean, don't want to take it to the extreme. We could talk about fraud, both from a civil law and a criminal law point of view. But I would not like to take it to the extreme because at any given point, a platform can say we sell NFTs, but we were not legally accurate. And it's fair enough. Just so if you think about it, if you go to Amazon or Google or whatever, they tell you that you can buy movies, but in reality, you can't. This is the tragedy of the digital space, that people are being promised ownership whereby they are only being granted access, right? That is a convention, unfortunately, that happened in the digital world, which was reinforced by market forces and, unfortunately, legal forces as well. I think our viewers need to understand that as we currently speak, from a legal point of view, there is no clear answer on whether we can have property rights over digital assets, right? You can find all kinds of different opinions on that. I can tell you, for as far as I can follow the European Union, that in the European Union, we have indirect indications, both from the Court of Justice of the European Union and from the European legislator, that the ownership over digital assets simply does not exist. And this is why I find NFTs interesting, because NFTs, both those on Ethereum and those on Bitcoin, like the inscriptions, despite the license that I sent on the chat, for all their shortcomings, both from a technical and a legal point of view, they prove a point that people are interested of having independent control over their digital assets. And if this trend carries on, I believe that this will make a legitimate case for reconsideration of our policy towards digital assets. To put it in simple terms, as we currently stand, European law has accepted the status quo in digital assets. And what is the status quo? That there is a powerful platform that has, in fact, ownership over the digital assets, and they only grant you access. That's currently what our current laws support, right? But if blockchain communities, NFT communities, inscriptions communities insist that there is a different, that there is an alternative, that there is a technological solution out there that will allow people to be more independent in their relationship with digital assets, that's probably a good starting point to renegotiate this arrangement. And it is necessary. By the way, the current legal arrangement in a way undermines NFTs. The people that say that they sell NFTs, I cannot blame them too much because they're not legal experts. But in reality, legally speaking, it's impossible.
Yeah.
And it's impossible because you can't have ownership on them.
So on that point, because we often view, especially like coders, the techies, we often view that the law is the way that the law is, and we're always opposing the law because we're writing code that does what it's supposed to do. But really and truly, the law is a living thing, and the law is defined by people. And in democracies, we vote in the legislators who write laws. So if in future the people believe that copyright laws should change, whatever should change, it could be the case that an NFT will legally represent some form of copyright ownership as well. Could that ever happen?
Yes, I agree. I agree with you. You put it, I think, in excellent terms, that the law is a living institution. It means that it develops over time, and more or less it reflects some kind of social consensus, right? And that is the beautiful thing about digital communities. You know, in law, we have spent the last 20 years treating digital communities as a threat, while in reality, they are a very interesting social experiment. They have brought a lot of changes, not only in our legal systems, but in the ways that we socialize and do other things. And I do believe a lot in the power of digital communities. I believe that if digital communities come up with arrangements that allow them to create new rights and new obligations, the law will eventually embrace that. And to give another example from a different historical period, this is not exclusive to digital communities. Nowadays, for example, everybody knows what a check is, right? I'm going to write you a check. But little do we know that 200 years ago, we could not take checks for granted. 200 years ago, checks did not exist. But how were they created? Because at some point, traders decided to use a piece of paper in order to tokenize rights and obligations. It became so prevalent in the market that the law had no other choice but to embrace it. Believe it or not, my impression is that tokens do the same thing. Tokens, in essence, are digital representations of rights and obligations. As long as digital communities support them, work on them, the law will embrace them. We're almost there. And to be honest, that is a good thing. Why? Because it creates legal certainty. Right now, we are spending our time in this webinar, right, trying to conceptualize what is the NFT from a legal sense. And we have some kind of a problem, right? It's not clear cut. I gave you an interpretation. If you had another legal colleague, he would give you a different one. But if we have some kind of a legislative intervention, that will allow us to communicate at the same level. Indeed. The difficult part, though, in a situation like that is who gets to influence the legislator. Exactly. And this is the point where I understand the skepticism of digital communities, because we all know that laws, of course, are susceptible to lobbying powers, right? If you look at certain laws that we have, especially in information technology law, they seem to be protecting certain interests, right? I'm not saying whether this is necessarily bad, or good or bad. I'm just making an observation, right? That the legislative process is a huge political struggle. But I'm optimistic because, Joshua, I have noticed the following change of attitude in the mind of the European legislator. If you look at the early directives and regulations that were regulating digital societies, the spirit of the law, the feeling that you would get after reading the text is that the law is afraid of technology, that the law looks at technology as some kind of evil, right? Over time, 20 years later, the change of attitude is astounding because the law keeps repeating that technology is an opportunity and we need to put it in a context that will allow us to harness the benefits of it. That's a huge paradigm change. I think only the GDPR is resisting that, is a little bit resisting in embracing digital technologies. Okay, I'm kidding a little bit, but there is this change of attitude. And as I told you in another point, legal communities talk about regulating digital assets, and that is good, right? The final outcome might not be perfect, but it's never perfect. It's like code, Joshua. You write the first version, you see the bugs, you update, right? It's the same with the law. You publish a new version, you let the courts decide what the bugs are, and eventually you decide whether you're going to allow courts to iron out the bugs or whether you're going to interfere. The difference is that the updates in your world come in seconds, whereby in our world, it might take up to 20 years, right?
Sometimes we can't update code, and it's smart contracts we can't, and we'll have that discussion on our Code is Law webinar.
Indeed.
So
Indeed.
to wrap up, because we're going over time, and maybe next time we'll allocate more to it.
Yes.
So we have NFTs, the traditional NFTs. Now we have the ability to have some form of token that's not just a Bitcoin or currency on the Bitcoin network. We can have digital collectibles like these CryptoPunks, where you have some form of ownership, again in inverted commas, of this punk. And now we also have seen Bitcoin punks on the Bitcoin network, which are more or less the same thing, just using the inscriptions. And Jonas sent this other 12-fold. What's interesting is that the Bitcoin punks are the exact same image as the CryptoPunks, and it's not done by the same people. So what about copyright there?
Yeah. There you have a violation of the right of reproduction and the right of communication to the public, right? It's as easy as that. The thing is, how are you going to enforce it? If you are able to identify those that have minted these versions, then probably you are in a good way of enforcing it. If not, then you will have to employ all kinds of blockchain magic to do so. I say is a violation of the right of reproduction, the right of communication to the public, although with some reservation, because it is debated in legal terms whether minting NFTs and the such amounts to these actions. Although if you market them under your name, although they belong to somebody else, I think the element of communication to the public will more or less be there. But you're right? These are also legitimate concerns, absolutely.
Indeed. So
we have a couple of questions, so I don't know whether we want to go through them, right?
Definitely. So as I guess people notice, we've raised a lot of questions, and we're talking from technology to a certain depth in this conversation, legal, there's economic factors. And in fact, this is why we put together a multidisciplinary masters where we look at the different aspects, because we need to have these discussions to come to conclusions. But yes, let's go through the questions. So we have a first question asking, what do you think about real estate and smart contracts? And what is your opinion regarding digital clothing? So shall I take a first shot at real estate and you can correct me on this?
Go ahead, Joshua.
So our real estate ownership is tracked by our land registry, and in Malta, and I imagine most other places have a similar setup where there's a land registry. Maybe certain countries don't, and they should have one because property can be stolen like that. But there should be nothing stopping us from replacing our land registry, whether it's physical written documents or a digital document, with a blockchain-based ownership of who owns what land. What is needed is that the law will honor the fact that if you have this token on the blockchain, it really represents your land in the real world, which is great. But now we're touching on the Code is Law issue. What happens if somehow someone takes away my land because they found my password, my key? Should that be allowed just because they got that token? So there are definitely some concerns there. What do you think, Jonas?
I more or less within the same line. I believe, first and foremost, I think Marie, thank you for the question. Real estate and smart contracts have been proposed several times as a match made in heaven. There are certain benefits that come with it. I would not deny that, right? That they might, smart contracts might allow to make certain parts of real estate transactions more efficient. I think in Greece and Malta, if you want to buy real estate nowadays, it will take several months before you are able to hold your property. In which case, I do believe that smart contracts can come with certain benefits. I think there are serious, although technological concerns, there are serious technological limitations in terms of bugs and the such, and we have to be mindful. In legal terms, all in all, I would say that smart contracts will have an equal treatment to other contracts, provided that they represent rights and obligations, right? That will make them contracts. End of story. Although there are certain areas and certain countries that are not so open to the idea of having such types of contracts in a digital form for reasons of their own. But it can be a use case. The ability, my feeling is that the ability of the blockchain to keep track in a public manner of assets is in essence what is the primordial characteristic of real estate transactions, right? Nowadays, we have physical books that date back to the 19th century, but you know, an update is probably a beneficial one. I don't think that it would be a problem. Now, when it comes to digital clothing, it really depends. It really depends as we, there are several layers to discuss here. When it comes to digital clothing, there are intellectual property considerations because the people that are minting the digital clothes might not be the ones that really have the rights. Designs and clothing can be protected by copyright, by design rights, by trademark. And of course, it also begs the question if we can talk about owning digital clothes, right? Which, as I said earlier, it is unclear whether we can have ownership rights over digital assets. Although digital communities behave like that. I know for sure that in certain gaming communities, if you buy a sword or if you buy an armor, you kind of feel that you own it, right? This is definitely the idea behind it. That's my comment on that. Then we have a second question by Alexander Zamit, which is a little bit legal, Joshua, so I think I might give it a go. Alexander is asking whether we can change this arrangement and instead of a license, when we have a peer-to-peer NFT transaction, we get a transfer of copyright. I would say yes, there is nothing stopping that in the sense that the copyright holder has full freedom to decide what they want to do with their asset. They can transfer it to somebody else, they can license it to somebody else. There is just a small asterisk here, and the asterisk is that not all copyright laws allow for the transfer of copyright, right? Not all copyright laws allow that. I know, for example, that Malta allows the transfer of copyright, but there are other jurisdictions that do not. So eventually, the answers to this question will depend a lot on the applicable copyright law. And when it comes to copyright, applicable copyright law, that is a very painful story in private international law. That will take another webinar to answer. But it is not easy to make sure which copyright law will apply beforehand, because NFTs are digital assets that can't be exchanged across borders, which means that you might create an NFT arrangement which under your own copyright law allows the transfer of copyright, but in another jurisdiction where eventually the transaction will develop consequences might not be the same. In which case, there is the element of legal uncertainty that the treatment of the same contract is not going to be the same across different jurisdictions.
Excellent. I think this is for you as well, Jonas.
Yes, that's from Violet. Violet, thanks for the question. Nice to see you again. It seems like she's one of those that didn't have enough of us, Joshua, because she has been also in one of our past events. She's asking me how do different jurisdictions deal with copyright law with NFT purchases and licensing. A US court decided that Gruyere cheese is not DOP because Americans have decided, and yes, indeed. Violet, you are on the spot. I think it goes within the same lines as my answer to Alex, that we have all kinds of different attitudes in that regard. It is difficult to give you a general pattern. We have to take it jurisdiction to jurisdiction. What I said about NFTs earlier is based on my knowledge of EU law, but other legal jurisdictions might have different attitudes in that regard. When it comes to the United States, I can tell you for sure that there is a lively discussion, at least in academic circles, about whether NFTs can amount to transfers of ownership and not license per se. But that again reflects the fact that different jurisdictions will have different attitudes.
Excellent. And Amr and Joe have similar-ish questions. So Amr asks, in terms of inscriptions, given that BTC is deflationary asset, its supply will eventually run out, or it'll be the same. Though I guess we could lose because people would not have access to their wallets. Does this mean that new inscription Bitcoin NFTs will not be possible to issue? So I would say first, and then Joe says, from the perspective of sound money, aren't ordinals a problem since they compromise the fungibility of Bitcoin? So I would say, first of all, let's look at how inscriptions take place and how individual Satoshis, ordinals, can be tracked. So each Satoshi has a physical number associated, a serial number associated with it. Now, where are these inscriptions being added? Number one, it's being added into the transaction, which is outputting that Satoshi, right? So we can, using the way, now Bitcoin differs a bit from Ethereum and other types of blockchains, where you have an account and you own an amount of crypto. Bitcoin, on the other hand, you have a UTXO. A UTXO is a transaction that hasn't been spent yet. And in this transaction, you have your Satoshi. It belongs to you. You have an unspent transaction, which basically means you have your Satoshi in this UTXO. So UTXOs, when I spend a transaction, I can spend any number of outputs that I want. I can send 1 Bitcoin to Ionis if I own 2 Bitcoin, and at the same time, send 1 Bitcoin to Amber. And we have these 2 Bitcoin UTXOs coming out from it. They could be Satoshis, 2 individual Satoshis. But you can also, with a UTXO, have any number of inputs coming into it. So I can get 2 of my different Satoshis and put them together. So I would say that if your unspent transaction is still spendable, even though it's a Satoshi, you can eventually combine these Satoshis together. So I do not see this as a problem specific in any way to ordinals or inscriptions. Now, when it comes to inscriptions and the fact that are we compromising the fungibility of Bitcoin because each Satoshi now is not equal? We might create a Satoshi with a Banksy on it, and that might be worth a lot of money. It's no longer exchangeable with another Satoshi. However, at the same time, we can do this with our dollar bills, with our euro bills. We have the same issue. So in the same instance, are euro notes not sound money? So I think we need to ask why this makes it not sound money, because we can associate value with our coins of the past that are worth much more. Now, there are also, to get around it, because this is a huge controversial issue in the Bitcoin community, there are also people who are saying these inscriptions, there may be no guarantee that this inscription will be there forever in future, because this inscription, this piece of art, is added at the end in a place in the transaction that has nothing to do with the transaction. You still own the UTXO, and euros are not sound money. So this data is irrelevant to the transaction. People are saying that in future, the miners could say, you know what, we're not going to keep track of that data. And that's a decision that the network can take. But these are, it's a philosophical debate that we have to have. And we'll see what the community decides over there. Some are saying that Bitcoin wasn't meant for this. Yeah, well, tough luck. What you actually implemented allows it. Now, what are we going to do about that? And I think this is the interesting discussion that we're going to see. That's one point I would say. And another point is, because there's some people saying this is going to clog up the network. Well, have we created a network that is susceptible to attacks based upon fair usage of that network? Then that's another problem we need to deal with. It's not about telling people, please don't do this. It's about, we need to make sure that our network is suitable for what it's trying to achieve. So I hope that answers the questions. I still see, Joe, in regards to fungibility of money, I still see that it's fungible. If I want to give my euro note with a Banksy to Ionis for €5, it's worth more because we give it value, but it's still worth the €5. So I don't really see that as an issue. And if that was an issue, then I would actually question the UTXO model, because UTXOs allow for us to have fungible coins, colored coins. So I think the community needs to have a more informed debate about both aspects to it, to come to a conclusion in regards to where we should actually, or where the community should actually take Bitcoin. So thanks everyone for joining us. We're definitely going to be having more of these discussions and inviting other people to get in on these discussions. And that's it for today. We haven't come up with a name for these webinars, but we will come up with something that hopefully will entice you to come to the next one. Jonas, anything?
Thanks very much for putting this together, Joshua. Thanks to everybody that stayed with us for the entire duration. And from my end, I very much look forward to doing this again.
Indeed. Thanks, everyone, and we'll speak soon, hopefully. Bye-bye.
Bye.